All right, let's dive into this stack of sources you've given us. We've got articles, research, notes from discussions, all centered on the latest in cybersecurity. It feels like the digital world is just constantly buzzing with threats, right?
It absolutely is, yeah. And what's striking about these sources is how they show just how broad and interconnected the threat landscape really is now. We're seeing everything from, nation-state level activity and big ransomware operations to vulnerabilities in everyday systems and even risks showing up in places you wouldn't immediately think of, like really unexpected places.
Totally. So our mission with this deep dive is to try and cut through all that noise, all that information. We're going to pull out the most important insights, maybe some surprising facts, and help you understand what's really happening out there based on this material. And I know some of this came out of conversations happening at a recent cybersecurity event down in Panama.
That's right, yeah. A portion of these insights stem directly from discussions, experiences shared at the Jornadas Root event in Panama. It provides a really grounded, kind of real-world perspective on many of these challenges we're about to talk about.
Okay, interesting. Let's start there then. What did the sources highlight as a key takeaway from that event, from people sharing notes from the front lines?
Well, one of the big themes coming out of those discussions, according to the sources, was the absolute necessity of, sharing information. Collaboration, cooperation across borders.
Makes sense.
Yeah, because cybersecurity isn't a problem one country or, one organization can solve alone. Because, as the sources noted, while countries face unique local issues, they're also dealing with a lot of common challenges, shared cyber attacks.
That makes perfect sense. Threats don't really stop at borders, do they?
Not at all.
Were there any specific examples discussed there that really illustrated the scale or maybe the diversity of these issues?
Yes, the sources mentioned a couple that were brought up. There was the situation with Spain's power blackout. Initially, it sparked fears of a cyber attack, although the sources clarified it turned out not to be. But it shows that heightened level of suspicion,
Yeah.
That tension.
Exactly. And then the really significant one was Costa Rica's experience with that massive, wide-ranging cyber attack. It hit the whole country.
Oh, I remember that. Huge news.
Yeah. Those examples really give you a sense of the real-world stakes involved.
Wow. Okay, so shifting from the event insights to some news and research highlighted in the sources, let's talk about larger-scale threats. Cisco Talos research is mentioned here. What did they uncover?
So Cisco Talos reported on activity they attribute to hackers they describe as Chinese-speaking.
Yeah.
And it's important to note, the sources are really clear on this point. Using the term Chinese-speaking is based on linguistic indicators in their analysis. It doesn't definitively prove state attribution or nationality.
Okay, just linguistic evidence. And what were these actors doing? They were actively exploiting a zero-day vulnerability.
Yeah.
One of those previously unknown software flaws.
The nasty kind.
Exactly. The kind nobody, not even the vendor, knows about yet, which makes them incredibly potent because there's no patch ready to stop them immediately.
Right. And who are they targeting with this zero-day?
Multiple U.S. local governments.
Yeah.
Specifically, systems running Trimble CityWorks software. Sources pointed out this software is widely used by public agencies for essential daily tasks, things like permits, licenses, work orders. Pretty critical stuff.
So exploiting a zero-day in software used for vital government functions sounds pretty serious. What was the immediate impact they were seeing?
Well, the sources indicated the attackers were using fairly standard hacking tools, but because they had that zero-day entry point, they quickly achieved remote code execution, which is, the most critical type. Basically lets them run anything on the system.
So full control.
Pretty much. The consequence was rapid control gain, leading to those government institutions becoming, inactive. Shut down.
Yeah. And this brings us back to a fundamental principle the sources highlighted, doesn't it? This idea of fix the basics.
Exactly, yeah. This specific incident, even with a sophisticated zero-day, it still underscores the point made repeatedly in the sources. Attackers thrive when basic security measures aren't universally applied. The sources stress that attackers can move from gaining that initial foot in the door via a vulnerability like this, to taking complete control and even deploying ransomware within hours.
Hours? Wow.
Yeah, especially if fundamental defensive actions haven't been taken.
That speed is terrifying. But, the sources also cover actions being taken against cybercrime. Microsoft working with the U.S. government, for example. Tell us about that one.
Yeah, this is a good example of the proactive side of cybersecurity. Microsoft, collaborating with the U.S. government, took action to disrupt a Russian malware group. It shows the level of international cooperation needed to tackle these groups effectively.
Okay. What kind of malware were they distributing?
The sources identified it as Luma Stealer, and as the name implies, it was designed to steal information. Info Stealer. Its primary goal was finding passwords, bank accounts, digital services, and then selling that stolen access.
Selling access. That sounds like a specific niche within the cybercrime world.
It really is. And the sources explained how the cybercrime ecosystem has become quite specialized. You have groups focused on different parts of the attack chain. Some might just develop the ransomware itself, the encryptor.
Right.
Others focus purely on gaining that initial access, and then others handle the deployment. This Luma Stealer group fits into that access broker category.
Access brokers. So they're just the specialists in getting the first foot in the door.
Precisely. Their whole business model is obtaining those initial accesses, often through stolen credentials or exploiting vulnerabilities, and then selling that access onto other criminal entities, particularly groups who specialize in deploying ransomware. It really highlights how professionalized and fragmented cybercrime has become.
Okay, moving from those big picture actions and threats to incidents affecting organizations we might see or interact with more regularly. The sources from BitLife Media had some interesting examples. How about the world of sports?
Yes, the cyber attack on Real Club Deportivo de La Coruña, the football club known as Depor. It was highlighted as a kind of relatable example.
Depor, okay. What happened there, according to the sources?
They experienced unauthorized access to their IT systems. A breach.
And what was compromised? Was it sensitive?
Personal data of season ticket holders was affected. Names, surnames, email addresses. The sources specifically noted, though, that financial or bank data was not compromised, which is an important distinction.
Okay, good distinction. And where did this intrusion occur? On their own servers or somewhere else?
The source mentioned it was an intrusion on a server hosted in Amazon Web Services, the AWS cloud.
Ah, the cloud. This brings up that concept. I know the sources discuss the shared responsibility model, right?
It does, yeah. And it's a crucial point illustrated by this example. The sources explain that in the cloud, providers like AWS, Azure, Google, they handle the security of the cloud.
Meaning the physical stuff.
Right. The underlying infrastructure, the hardware, the global network. But the user, in this case, Depor, is responsible for security in the cloud.
Security in the cloud?
Yeah.
Meaning what exactly for the user? Like, what's their job?
It means they're responsible for everything running on that infrastructure. So the operating system, the applications they deploy, and critically the data security. The sources really stress the user's responsibility here, keeping systems updated, patched, protected.
Passwords and stuff.
Using strong credentials, passwords or ideally public-private keys. Making sure ports aren't just left exposed to the internet, and implementing constant monitoring.
It sounds like you can't just sort of assume the cloud provider is taking care of everything for you. The source used an analogy for this, didn't it? Something about driving.
They did, yeah. We compared it to driving a car. Having safety features like an airbag is important. That's kind of like the cloud provider's infrastructure security. But you, as the driver, are still responsible for driving safely, obeying traffic laws, not speeding.
Right.
That's the user's responsibility for configuration, patching, monitoring. Cybersecurity isn't passive. You don't just achieve it by using the cloud. It requires active effort.
That analogy makes it very clear. Okay, another sector highlighted in the sources from BitLife Media was retail with the Adidas incident.
Yes, Adidas publicly communicated a data breach. And this one is interesting because it highlights the supply chain risk that the sources also brought up.
How did the supply chain play into the Adidas breach? Was it one of their suppliers?
Exactly. The breach occurred through a third-party provider that Adidas used for customer service. It's a perfect example of how your own security posture can be compromised by vulnerabilities in the companies you partner with and rely on.
What data was compromised in this case? Financial again?
No, the sources stated it was data necessary for customer service operations. Things like names, addresses, email, phone numbers. Again, the sources noted that financial or payment data was not compromised.
Okay, but even without financial details, isn't that still enough data for attackers to work with? Seems like it could be.
Absolutely. The sources emphasized that even seemingly less sensitive data, like names, emails, phone numbers, it's more than enough for attackers to launch sophisticated social engineering attacks.
Phishing.
Targeted phishing scams, yeah. Impersonation attempts, things like that.
Did Adidas handle this transparently, according to the sources? Did they let people know?
Yes. The sources noted Adidas was transparent in notifying both customers and relevant authorities. But the key takeaway from this incident, as stressed in the material, is the critical importance of your third-party providers in your overall security strategy. They're an extension of your own security perimeter, really.
Whether you think of it that way or not. Okay, moving from everyday businesses to something, well, far more critical. Hospitals. The sources had a pretty concerning statistic about hospitals being at risk.
They did. Yeah, it's quite stark. The sources reported that a significant percentage, 58% of hospitals, are at risk of cyber attacks.
58%.
Wow.
Why are hospitals particularly vulnerable? It seems like they'd be top priorities for security.
Well, the sources explained a major systemic challenge. Hospitals and similar critical infrastructure, like, say, industrial facilities, often use very old systems. The sources specifically mentioned Windows XP and Server 2003 still being in use in some places.
Windows XP, seriously, that's ancient history in tech years.
It truly is. But the sources explain that the medical or industrial equipment these systems control or interact with often has a very long amortization cycle. We're talking decades.
Right, that expensive MRI machine isn't replaced every few years.
Exactly. And manufacturers often don't provide updates for the software on these old systems. Replacing entire pieces of expensive medical equipment just because the OS is old is, well, often cost prohibitive. The sources use the specific phrasing, "this is handled by procurement Congress," highlighting that this isn't necessarily a tech decision driven by IT, but an organizational and budgetary challenge.
So they're kind of caught between relying on crucial but ancient vulnerable systems and the immense cost of replacing everything.
Yeah, that's the core dilemma, yeah. However, the sources were clear, this can't just be viewed as a budget problem. It absolutely requires a cybersecurity strategy. The primary mitigation strategy recommended in the sources is to isolate these old vulnerable systems as much as possible.
Isolate them? How would that isolation work in practice? Like, take them offline?
Potentially disconnecting them entirely from the main network, yeah. Or, more likely, placing them on separate, heavily segmented network zones. The idea is that if an attacker breaches the main hospital network, these decades-old machines, with their easily exploitable outdated security measures, are much harder to reach and compromise. Segment them off.
It seems like a necessary step, even if it requires, re-architecting networks and stuff. This isn't just a technical fix, but a strategic one.
Exactly. It moves from being a question of, can we afford to replace this, to, can we afford not to isolate this, given the potential impact.
Right. Okay. You mentioned that insights from the Panama event included an autopsy of a ransomware. Let's take a deeper dive into that part of the sources. What's the current state of ransomware based on those expert discussions? Is it still as bad as ever?
Yeah. The sources described ransomware as being in full form and a very lucrative business, still very much active. While some specific groups might temporarily pause their activities, maybe to rebrand or deal with internal issues or try to evade tracking, the overall threat remains incredibly strong and persistent.
And there's been a significant evolution, right? It's often not just about encrypting files anymore. There's more to it now.
That's the critical development the sources highlighted. The rise of double extortion. Attackers don't just encrypt your data and hold it hostage anymore. Before they encrypt, they steal sensitive data from your network.
Okay. What kind of sensitive data are they specifically targeting, according to the sources? What are they looking for?
The sources listed specific examples of the personal data they prioritize. Things like payrolls, employee IDs, passports, and medical data in healthcare settings. Really sensitive personal info.
And how do they use that stolen personal data for extortion? Is that the second part?
That's the second part, yeah. If the victim doesn't pay the ransom to decrypt their files, the attackers then threaten to publish all that stolen data. They often use sites on the dark web, like Tor sites, for this. And they specifically leverage the legal and reputational pressure from data protection regulations, like GDPR,
right,
to force companies to pay, even if those companies have good backups and can actually restore their systems.
So wait, even having robust backups doesn't fully protect you from a double extortion attack anymore?
Precisely, yeah. Restoring from backups addresses the encryption part, getting your systems back online. But it doesn't solve the problem of your sensitive customer or employee data already being in the attacker's hands and potentially about to be leaked publicly. That's the double leverage. It's nasty.
That really changes the calculation for victims. Given this evolution, what's the most crucial piece of advice or preparation highlighted in the sources for dealing with ransomware?
Crisis preparation. Hands down. The sources were emphatic. Improvisation is absolutely the worst approach during an attack. You need a plan before disaster strikes.
Like having a fire drill before the building actually catches fire. Makes sense.
Exactly that analogy. The sources strongly recommend companies develop and actually practice a crisis protocol. Running simulations or tabletop exercises is invaluable.
What do those simulations help uncover? Like, what's the benefit?
Well, they help reveal gaps in your plan by testing how different teams, technical response, communications, legal, leadership, how they would react under real pressure. You learn where your communication channels might break down or who needs to do what and when. It fleshes out the weaknesses. The sources also stress the importance of having prearranged partners, like incident response firms, with clear contracts and SLAs already in place.
So you're not scrambling to find help during the crisis.
Exactly. And a crucial, often overlooked detail. Establish parallel communication channels, not relying on your potentially compromised corporate network. Like, have a plan B for talking.
So preparation isn't just like one step in the process. It's really the foundation for everything else.
The sources couldn't be clearer. Preparation is the most important phase of the entire incident response cycle. To use the analogy the sources provided, it's too late to put seatbelts on the car when you're already in the crash.
That paints a very clear, very stark picture of the necessity. Okay, let's talk about how these attacks typically unfold. The sources broke down the attacker's playbook, didn't they? How does a typical intrusion happen step by step?
They did, and it's often a very structured process, often automated in parts and alarmingly fast.
Okay, what's step one? How do they usually get in the door?
The most common entry method, according to the sources, is via stolen credentials, particularly where second-factor authentication 2FA isn't enabled. Attackers buy these credentials from those access brokers we talked about earlier,
right,
who acquire them from data leaks or phishing campaigns. It's highlighted as the most sort of habitual method right now.
Are there other common ways in?
Yeah, exploiting unpatched, known vulnerabilities that are exposed to the internet is another route. While maybe sometimes less common than using stolen creds. If an attacker finds a system with a known flaw that hasn't been patched, well, it's an open door for them.
Okay, so they're inside, maybe with just a low-level user account. What's the next move in their playbook? What do they do then?
Step 2 is privilege escalation and lateral movement. Once they have that initial foothold, often with minimal privileges, their immediate goal is to find and compromise systems that grant them higher privileges. Usually that means targeting the Active Directory or domain controllers in a typical Windows environment. That's the keys to the kingdom.
And how do they jump from being a basic user to, like, an administrator?
The sources noted this is often achieved by exploiting misconfigurations in Active Directory itself, which are surprisingly common, or finding and exploiting unpatched internal vulnerabilities. Companies often focus heavily on patching what's exposed to the internet, right? But attackers are skilled at finding and exploiting flaws inside the network to move laterally and gain elevated access. They scan the internal network, map things out.
So once they have that administrator access, they can essentially go anywhere and see pretty much anything on the network.
Pretty much, yeah. And that leads directly to step 3, data exfiltration. With admin access, they start moving laterally through the network, specifically hunting for that sensitive data we mentioned. The sources gave examples like HR files, payrolls, customer databases, medical records, and this happens with incredible speed. The sources noted they can steal hundreds of gigabytes of data in hours. They are very efficient at locating specific types of valuable data.
Hours again, wow. And the ransomware itself, deploying the actual malware, that's the final step.
Correct. Step 4 is ransomware deployment. The encryption is the last action in this carefully structured, often automated attack chain. The sources highlighted the time to ransom, that time from initial access to deploying the ransomware can be just hours, even in organizations with some existing security measures in place. They also pointed out attackers frequently use legitimate system administration tools, things already present on the network, which can help them evade traditional security alerts that might look for obviously malicious files flying under the radar.
It's really unnerving how quickly and systematically this can happen. So based on this playbook, what are the essential countermeasures? The ABCs of protection the sources recommended.
Yeah, the sources distilled the key defensive steps directly addressing these attack stages. Pretty logically.
Okay, first, tackling that initial access problem, stolen credentials and vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. First and foremost, implement second-factor authentication, 2FA, on all accesses, everywhere possible. This dramatically reduces the risk of stolen credentials being used for initial entry. It's huge.
Okay. Second, for the vulnerabilities.
Patch and update software regularly. Keep things up to date. The sources use the phrase, estar lo máximo posible al día de todos los parqueos, basically. Stay as up-to-date as humanly possible with all patches, both external and internal.
Makes sense. Protecting the actual computers, the endpoints themselves.
Yeah, use good endpoint and server protection solutions.
Yeah.
The sources mentioned EDR's endpoint detection and response systems, but the crucial addition from the sources here is ensuring you have a service, whether it's internal or external, capable of reacting quickly. We're talking minutes or hours.
Not days.
Not days, exactly. Reacting to the early alerts these EDR systems generate. Detection without a rapid response isn't enough to stop these fast-moving attacks.
Okay. What about that internal privilege escalation step, getting admin rights?
Properly configure Active Directory. Harden it. Prevent the common flaws attackers exploit to gain higher privileges internally. This requires specific expertise, but it's critical.
Right. And the final layer, anything else?
Add multiple layers of protection and monitoring. Don't rely on just one thing. The sources suggested duplicando el tipo de, digamos, de visibilidad de alerta por capas. Basically, duplicate your visibility and alerts through different security layers. Think defense in depth, rather than relying on a single tool that could potentially be bypassed.
When you lay it out like that, the steps sound manageable, logical, but I know the sources also acknowledge the immense complexity here in practice.
They did, yeah. While the steps are logically tied to the attack chain, executing them effectively in a large, complex environment requires constant analysis, monitoring, and adaptation. It's definitely not a checkbox you tick once a month. It's an ongoing, relentless effort because the attackers are constantly refining their methods too.
Definitely. Okay, let's wrap this up by bringing it home a bit. The sources also touched on risks in our personal digital lives, specifically mentioning online gaming. I know many of us, or people we know, spend time in that world, kids especially.
Yes, the Espacio Seguro section in the sources covered this, and it's important context. Video games themselves aren't inherently bad, but the online environment definitely introduces certain risks.
Right. Beyond the obvious ones, like maybe spending too much time playing, what cybersecurity risks did the sources point out related to gaming?
Well, they mentioned cyberbullying within in-game chats, which is unfortunately common. But they also highlighted the risks of contact with strangers online.
Which can be particularly concerning, especially for younger players, right?
Exactly. The sources noted that strangers encountered online might misrepresent their age or intentions. And conversations can sometimes escalate to dangerous requests for, say, photos or even attempts to arrange in-person meetings. Grooming risks.
Yeah, that's scary stuff. And there's a financial risk too, wasn't there?
Yes. The sources highlighted the risk of in-game purchases. Buying challenges, virtual currency, cosmetic items. It often uses credit cards linked to accounts. And children in particular might make significant purchases without fully understanding the real-world cost involved, racking up big bills.
So what was the recommendation from the sources for parents or guardians regarding their kids' online gaming? How can they help?
The core recommendation was really for parents and guardians to engage with and understand their kids' digital lives, not necessarily in a surveillance or intrusive way, but just to be aware of what platforms they're using, who they might be interacting with, and the potential risks involved. So they are equipped to provide guidance and support if needed. It's really about shared understanding and keeping lines of communication open.
Wow, okay. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground in this deep dive, drawing entirely from the sources you provided. From global threat intelligence and the anatomy of ransomware attacks, right down to vulnerable hospitals, incidents impacting sports clubs and major retailers, and even the personal risks in online gaming.
It really highlights how pervasive cybersecurity is today, doesn't it? It touches just about every aspect of our lives and requires vigilance at every single level.
And the overwhelming message I'm getting from the sources seems to be that cybersecurity isn't a passive defense. It's not something you just install and forget about. It's an active, ongoing process.
Absolutely. That's the core takeaway. It requires constant attention, from implementing those fundamental basics like 2FA and patching, to understanding complex attacker methodologies, and crucially, preparing for incidents before they happen.
So let's leave you, the listener, with this thought from the sources to ponder. Attackers can move incredibly fast. Remember that time to ransom, measured in mere hours, even against large organizations that presumably have some security in place. It makes you reflect on that core principle repeated throughout. Fix the basics. In your own digital world, whether that's personal or professional, how truly solid are those fundamental security basics? Are you prepared for that kind of speed?
It's a vital question to consider, as the digital threat landscape just keeps evolving around us.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Until next time.